So my name is Anthony Reddy, um, and I am your host along with my colleague Carol Troop. So thank you for coming for the launch of this book, Bonhoeffer and the Voice of the Others, Critical Essays on Bonhoeffer's Theology in a World of Struggle, edited by Tim Judson, Alison Walker, and myself. I will probably say the least about the book because I will let Tim and Alison do more of the conversations. That's largely because they know a lot more about Bonhoeffer than I do. And also because I thought I would sort of kick off with some brief introductions and then hand over to other people and be the kind of MC. So it's a little bit really about the Centre. So the Centre for Black Theology began in January 2025. It is an interdisciplinary research-based initiative focused on the intellectual development of Black theology in Britain and across the world. And although this text is not a Black theological text by any means, one of the reasons why I was interested in being involved in it is that those who are familiar with the work of James Cone, who is the widely recognized founder of the intellectual discipline of Black theology, will know that Cone didn't have a lot of time for many white academic theologians, except for the fact that he was a big fan of Bonhoeffer. And so I kind of worked on the basis that anyone who Cone thought was cool, that is someone actually I should read and maybe I should think is cool as well. So I have to confess that I did not come to Bonhoeffer as a Bonhoeffer scholar, but as someone who was a fan of James Cone. And that's what kind of sort of drew me into this conversation, but I don't want to say too much and encroach across the terrain that will be covered by Tim in a moment. So our centre, as I said, starting in January 2025, and it grew out of my appointment as the first professor of Black theology in Oxford University in September 2023. That's a historic first within Oxford University, which is both, I suppose, if we hold two things in as being intention, is both a great honour for myself and maybe an indictment for the university at the same time. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. And we're based in Regent's Park College, which is a permanent private hall of the University of Oxford. And there are two of us in the centre, myself and my research associate, Carol Troop. Within our work within the centre, so we do consultancy-based work, we do original research for publications, we host events such as this one. Between us, we also oversee the publication Black Theology and International Journal that's published by Taylor and Francis. I have served as the editor-in-chief for a number of years, and Carol, my colleague, she serves as the reviews editor. In addition to this existing work, we are also developing a Black theology book series with Baylor University Press that is still in its early gestations, but we will be looking for texts, hopefully, like to commission for that book series. We work in partnership with, obviously, with the wider faculty of the University of Oxford and also in partnership with the University of South Africa, where I'm also a professor extraordinaris. Our past events have been quite a few since we started. I think our first official event was to launch Tim's book, The White Bonhoeffer. That was back in spring of 2025, I think, last summer. But our last event was an online seminar to celebrate the publication of three books by three very, very promising and very exciting Black women scholars in Britain. So we had books by Selena Stone, also Victoria Amotoso, and Alicia Louis. So those books, that was an event we did last December. So anyway, so on this occasion, we are here today. So our program is as follows. So at the moment, I'm going to hand over to Tim. So get yourself ready, Tim. And then Tim will say something about the backstory to the book in terms of how it came about and how we, I guess, that chose the various contributors. Then we'll hand over to Alison, who will, Alison Walker will talk about the book. particularly its relationship to theological education, mission, and ministry. Then we will hand over to Reggie, who will then speak hopefully about significance of the book in relation to the Bonhoeffer Guild, and then responding to all three will be Michael Mawson from New Zealand, and then hopefully that should give us a good bit of time for Q&A at the end, in which we will encourage you to put your questions into a chat box or to raise a digital hand, and I'll call upon my colleague Carol at that point to try and help me sort of see who wants to ask a question, and hopefully we should be done by 9 o'clock. So that's enough of me. And now hand over to Tim.
Great, thanks, Anthony. It's really exciting for me actually, because I came to Dietrich Bonhoeffer through two avenues, and I talk about this in a journal article. I discovered Bonhoeffer. I mean, I was aware of him, but when I went to Bristol Baptist College, I became aware of him through reading the work of James Cone, very much encouraged to by Anthony Reddy. And also by doing a module on Karl Barth. And it was just crazy that my Barth tutor, Justin Stratis, just happens to be here this evening. So, mate, it's all your fault that I'm here tonight, or half your fault, half Anthony's fault. Yeah, so it was reading Barth, basically rehashing Bonhoeffer in Dogmatics 4, that I kind of came to Bonhoeffer. There's probably a more nuanced way to put that, but anyway. But it's been a real privilege to have had the opportunity to co-edit this project with Professor Reddy and Reverend Dr. Walker, and to work with numerous contributors from across the globe who've offered their insights in the book's various chapters. Thank you also to the Bloomsbury T&T Clark team, and to Mike Mawson for his kind of series editor support as well. That could bring this manuscript to its eventual completion. And my task this evening's still very simple compared to everyone else, really, which is just to describe the journey that led to the publication of Bonhoeffer and the Voice of the Other, and to sketch maybe some initial observations as to why the book seems appropriate and relevant now. So, as Anthony said, the book's origin goes back a way, and there was, I think, about 2023 where I was having a conversation with Anthony about Dietrich Bonhoeffer at Regent's Park College, where we both worked at the time. And as a Black liberation theologian, Anthony appeared sympathetic to much of Bonhoeffer's thinking as well as his lived example. And given that Bonhoeffer was regarded as a standout exemplar of Christian responsibility and costly discipleship by folks like James Cone, Anthony, as he's put it, thought that Bonhoeffer was cool too. And others in his field also remembered and continue to remember Bonhoeffer with respect and admiration. That said, both Anthony and I also shared a similar concern in this conversation that much of Bonhoeffer's corpus carried an unqualified freight at times, as well as latent assumptions in relation to certain ideas on doctrine, ethical responsibility, things like agency, suffering, human relations, religion and culture, justice, as well as other themes in his theology and ethics that had been largely uninterrogated within the hagiographical legacy of the Bonhoeffer Guild. And it seems to both of us that Bonhoeffer was a worthy dialogue partner for navigating the complexity and contingency of life and the increasing divisions in society that we face today as we discern alongside others who Jesus Christ really is for us today. But at the same time, both of us wanted to avoid deifying Bonhoeffer or his thinking, and to ask questions of Bonhoeffer with Bonhoeffer in light of emerging research and some of the acute contemporary challenges that we face. So as other scholars have rightly highlighted, almost anyone, it would seem, feels at liberty to kind of claim Bonhoeffer for their own ecclesial or political purposes, oftentimes uncritically. Therefore, in our minds, it seemed as though it could be fruitful to come to the table to engage in Bonhoeffer's thinking, by inviting a range of voices and experiences, those with horizons and emphases that would contrast the majority of thinkers that have hitherto helped to generate the ongoing legacy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life and work. In other words, we wanted to push beyond the constraints of discerning how to live for and with others from within the epistemological landscape of those who are similar to him, people like me. And instead, we were interested in how those who are continually posited as the other in much Bonhoefferian discourse may themselves actually offer generative thinking for those who are asking questions similar to Bonhoeffer, but whose semiotic particularity remains demarcated within the oftentimes invisible and unacknowledged contours, limitations, and inadequacies mediated through the Bonhoeffer legacy. So we're aware this is not a totally unique aim, but we wanted to broaden the scope of engagement in Bonhoeffer beyond those who would primarily identify themselves as Bonhoeffer scholars per se, to see what could be yielded. And this led to us organising the one-day symposium where various contributors were invited to give papers engaging Bonhoeffer's theological ethics for today. Sadly, though inevitably and understandably, some papers were not able to be included in the symposium. And whilst most of the people whose papers were turned down were extraordinarily gracious and supportive, there were a few people who appeared to be confused, put out, or even offended that their papers had not been selected, which came as a bit of a shock because I'd never organised a symposium before. And it was noteworthy to us that all of the people who responded with a kind of negative criticism upon not being selected were all representative of a specific demographic. And this is not in any way to cast a judgment on the character of any particular background. However, the reason I mention this is merely to observe that the frustration and perplexity characteristic of a few solely within a certain demographic was not evident in anyone else. And I wonder whether this is possibly indicative of the albeit sincere concern amongst some that their voice must be heard, that the space should be inhabited by them, and that they maybe put more stake in their own ability to hold space and to speak for the sake of others than to surrender those spaces to the others that they are seeking to live for and with. Others who may yet use the space in surprising and renewing ways. So for Anthony and myself, this highlighted all the more to us how important it was to mediate the space within that 2023 symposium, where no space is really neutral anyway, by foregrounding those people who are often subordinated or relativized as the other within much academic theology and within Bonhoeffer studies, I would think as well. Then our symposium was held on Monday, the 15th of May, 2023 at Regent's Park College in Oxford. And the day itself was rich. And as the book demonstrates, there was a tremendous appreciation for Bonhoeffer within the discussions. And amidst the common gratitude for Bonhoeffer, as well as the scholarship surrounding him, we also appreciated that Bonhoeffer, to quote the Apostle Paul, sees in a mirror dimly and does not have all the answers. And we sensed that the scope of the content from the symposium could have been even broader if time and maybe finances had allowed. And so we made the decision to incorporate some more contributions to submit a book proposal for an edited volume in the New Studies in Bonhoeffer's Theology and Ethics series. Alison Walker, a good friend of mine, and our third co-editor, had presented a paper at the original symposium and was kindly able to lend her time and very careful eye to assist in the editing process. And whilst there are subjects and contributors that obviously could have made the book even richer, we've sought to give a voice to those who have engaged Bonhoeffer from numerous perspectives that are broader than the conventional guild. And to use Bonhoeffer's terms, this contribution carries much that is penultimate, and therefore is provisional and not without its limitations. But we hope to have recognized the freedom of those limitations at points. And we're also really glad that we're not the only ones seeking to foreground people's contributions from a global majority perspective in contexts like Oxford. People whose insight and scholarship have been prophetic, certainly for people like myself, who are formed within the predominantly white Western tradition, whilst at the same time being within that. Now, the book offers chapters from a range of scholars who represent England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Germany, the United States, Mexico, Brazil, South Korea, China, with each person drawing observations as both women and men, black, brown, white, disabled, able-bodied, with different social contexts, shaping each person's approach around a plethora of subjects. Now, in a cultural climate where, whether progressive or conservative, many of us seem anemic to the costly task of respectful and robust struggle together, where interactions are fraught and complex. We hope that this book might enable readers to think critically in relation to Bonhoeffer's life and work, whilst also finding in him a fallible follower of Jesus Christ, who, like us all, I hope, is seeking both to witness anew and to witness to the God revealed in Jesus Christ within the spatial, temporal, and creaturely particularity of our lives for and with one another. Thank you, Anthony.
Yes, thank you very, very much, Tim. I appreciate your diplomacy in terms of articulating sort of some of the people who were not quite so gracious in terms of not being in the book. It did remind me, although I have to say in a much more polite English way, of this memorable occasion, which I think Reggie might remember. So back in the AAR, maybe about 10 years or so ago, there was a Black theology and the Bonhoeffer group had this joint um, panel. And the panel was to celebrate Reggie's book, which if you've not bought it yet, then shame on you. That's Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, which is a fantastic book, almost as good as this book. No, I'm joking. Actually, it's a lot better than this book, but even so. And what was fantastic about that particular occasion was there were a group of of very venerable, let's say, older white, older men of a certain demographic. Like they were white men. Let's just be honest with you. That's what we're talking about. There were older white men, and let's just say that they were not quite so gracious on the kind of things that Reggie was saying about their glorious hero. Even though clearly, if you read the book, you know that Reggie loves Bonhoeffer in the same way I do and others do. But I will get to that in a moment. So next up, we have the Reverend Dr. Alison Walker, who was, as Tim said, she was a participant on the day, wrote a fantastic chapter that is in the book. But then we had, I'm not sure it was Tim's idea or my idea, as it was a good idea, I'll say it was mine, to invite Alison to come and join us because she, I mean, her meticulous eye just made this job so much easier than it would have been otherwise. And so thank you very, very much, Alison, for your contribution, both on the day in terms of editing the book, and now I invite you to say a little bit about the book from your perspective. So, Alison.
Anthony. I hope my internet is stable enough, so wave if it cuts out. Really wonderful to be with you this evening, and yeah, I'm really grateful for Anthony and Tim for including me in this project in terms of editing the book, and likewise the conference day at Regent's Park, the symposium, was a really enjoyable day of hearing such different voices thinking through about Bonhoeffer's legacy and maybe different ways to I'd encountered in other contexts. So that was really exciting to be part of that day on a very sunny day as well, which was lovely. So just to provide a bit of context of where I'm approaching this, I'm a priest in the Church of England, served my curacy in kind of fairly rural context, and now work in theological education. so I'm kind of thinking through, I guess, a little bit about this book, both in the context of someone who is teaching theology, ministry, and mission to students, but also thinking, both as how to teach this, but also how students might engage with some of this material as well. And also I'm kind of, my context is that I'm teaching theology to students who, bless them, are doing it often part-time alongside jobs and caring responsibilities. So, and are very much bedded in their context as they're learning. So that provides sometimes different challenges of helping them to understand the value of really theologically reflecting on these issues and not always jumping to pragmatics. So giving some of the theological tools there, I think, is really important, and this book does that really well. But I'm going to start, and this might seem slightly bizarre, so bear with me. I had the opportunity to go to a different book launch in Bristol a few weeks ago to this book called Frontierlands by Hazel Sheffield. This is not a theological book. She's a journalist. And in this book, she's basically exploring, in the context of Great Britain, how cash-strapped local councils in the last decade or so have sold off numerous public spaces. So land, playing fields, swimming pools, museums, libraries have all been kind of sold underneath, without often local communities even knowing this was happening. These buildings have been sold to generate some cash for councils, essentially. And her point, that she's kind of, one of the things that she's raising is both that this loss of like public space within communities, but also how it's not just the kind of physical loss of these spaces, but that she writes that certain people, they found that the cuts had created a culture of mistrust among common belonging diminished. This sense of abandonment, of door slamming in people's spaces has been linked in studies to political polarization and the vote to leave. See where I'm going, hopefully, in a second. But in this book launch that I went to, there was this like ensuing conversation with the people on the panel about essentially what it means to be human living within our local communities today. So about how various crises that we're living through, kind of climate crisis, cost of living crisis, highlights our dependence on one another, our need for one another. And their point was kind of the loss of these public spaces undermines that sense of meeting the other, basically meeting those who we might now cast as sort of someone who's a threat to us. And it was fascinating to me that they were describing, I thought, really well what it means to be a human, but without necessarily any reference to God at all. But they were touching on something really important. And for me, that's something that I kind of, about what it means to be human, that I would use in theological language, particularly I would use in theological language drawing on Bonhoeffer. So that's where I'm kind of coming to. But it was interesting that they saw these kind of public places that have been lost as a way to face local challenges together and to meet, like I said, to meet the other that without those physical places might be cast on social media or on news outlets as a threat or a person to fear or to be scared of incomers into their local environments. But coming back to Bonhoeffer, I think Bonhoeffer for me speaks of what it means to be a creature in relationship with our creator. And I often come back to Bonhoeffer's commentary on Genesis, creation and fall, to explore those themes. That's themes I return to over and over again. And there's lots of chapters within our book, which is kind of asking those questions with Bonhoeffer of what it means to be a human and how to, in our current concrete situations that we face today. But Bonhoeffer's language of that dependence on God primarily, but also dependence on one another, that to be a creature, to live rightly as a creature, is to acknowledge our dependence on fellow creatures, fellow humans, other creatures as well. I was extend to that, and to know that limit of what it means to be a creature, to know that limit actually as a grace, that kind of what it means to be a creature, and that we bear that limit of creaturely existence with others. That's something that Bonhoeffer's taught me. Well, in the fall, we choose to ignore our dependence on God, ignore our dependence on one another, and stand alone and isolated, not living into that relationality, but instead refusing and believing we can be self-sufficient, essentially. So for me, Bonhoeffer, I think, is one of the most helpful images of sin. And for those who are familiar with Creation and Fall, that visual picture he presents, I think, is one of the most helpful ways to kind of engage students in thinking through what sin is. So I engage myself in that part of Bonhoeffer in my chapter 7, looking at that visual imagery and then exploring that further with looking at icons of the Black Christ and icons of African saints and those of African descent. But also Matthew in chapter 1, Matthew Kirkpatrick, his chapter, he's also drawing on some of those insights from Creation and Fall and from other bits of Bonhoeffer as well. And that what Matthew is arguing in chapter 1, which I think is really helpful, is that idea of struggling with the other actually being a positive encounter as a creaturely good. So he's providing in his chapter, which is the opening chapter of the book, some kind of theological foundations to consider questions of what it means to struggle rightly with another. So something as struggle is something positive when it is with and for the other, not struggle as a relationship of domination, but struggling with someone. So he argues that for Bonhoeffer, struggle is a good part of creation, and it's the way we understand ourselves and understands each other and sort of perceive our own identity by struggling with the other. While at the fall, the other is no longer seen as that gift of God's grace to help us understand who we are. We now live in that isolation and that judgment of others and judgment of God's word. And he writes, struggle is now captive to our fears and insecurities. So the way struggle has been kind of become broken. And he talks about Bonhoeffer's solution to those problems. And one of them is trying to kind of re-establish the goodness of community, which includes that authentic struggle with the other in all its rich earthly relationality, Matthew writes. So seeing something as kind of that authentic struggle being generative for our common community life. Which brings me back to Hazel's book that I was talking about at the beginning, about the removal of public spaces from our context in the Great Britain, where like what concerns me in light of her book is if these spaces of where we're going to have that possible encounter with others are being taken away from us, those sites of struggle where we could have this potentially positive idea, a part of seeing sort of Jesus's redemption, redeeming work in those encounters, that if those sites are being removed, are being undermined, are being destroyed by the powers and principalities of this world, how are we going to encounter the other in kind of rich and meaningful ways? Where is that going to happen? And I guess my question is, where can the role of the church be potentially, of the community of faith, in being an environment where people maybe can encounter one another who wouldn't otherwise meet one another? Can the church be those places of authentic struggle as part of God's reconciling work for creation? And particularly in my context, like rural environments, often the church is the last remaining sort of public building in a community. What I think we found in our book Bonhoeffer and the Voice in the Other is lots of different people exploring some of these questions within the concrete scenarios that they find themselves in. Those questions of struggling with one another in kind of challenging ways, but also hopefully in these positive ways that as Matthew Kirkpatrick frames it. I think thinking about the role of the church, specifically Craig's chapter 4, offering this imagined letter of Bonhoeffer responding to the 5 marks of mission, I think is brilliant. And I think it's also really good to engage students who might otherwise maybe struggle sometimes with kind of formal academic writing, to give them something that kind of presented in this way as a letter, I think might help grasp the imaginations of those who might otherwise find things challenging, perhaps. But I think Craig's reflections on thinking about what mission should look like today for the life of the church, I think, are really pressing. So that making sure kind of prayer and worship are rooted at the start, so we don't just become a church that is sort of just concerned like social concern or mere politics. Thinking about what telling looks like. How do we speak of Christ in our current context? So how do we speak of Christ in this context where we maybe don't come into physical encounter with the other anymore? Instead, the other is just, you know, on our newsfeed or social media in ways that might be damaging and harmful. And what does it mean to tend to care for the world, to serve the world, while also not wanting to kind of advance the privileged place of the church, which I definitely see in my context, that sometimes it feels like our tending is for the holding up of the church as an institution rather than actually to care and to tend and to serve people. I've probably said enough, but I just want to reiterate, I think there's some really great chapters in the book kind of engaging with the different sort of scenarios that sort of Tim's already alluded to, kind of in so far-right Protestantism in South Korea, which actually could be relatable to other people in different contexts as well who might be struggling with that in their situation, or Carlos Caldas engaging with Bonhoeffer to present an eco-theology, which again could be relevant to different contexts. But I think for me it demonstrates to both students and teachers of theology how to kind of the mode, I guess, of their theological thinking, to have sort of roots that in different places of the tradition, not just Bonhoeffer, but going beyond Bonhoeffer, but also really engaging with the concrete scenarios of where they might find themselves and what their ministry might look like. So I hope there's like a richness that could be fruitful for those engaging in theological education. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your input, Alison. As I said, I feel like you were an indispensable part of the team in terms of getting this book actually out on time in the shape in which it is in. So thank you very much. And I think also like for reminding us that one of the important things that we've tried to do in the book is to pitch it at a level that enables a whole number of people of being able to engage with. I think certainly sometimes maybe one of the struggles when you think of something like Bonhoeffer. So my undergraduate degree was in church history, but I remember at Birmingham University, we were on floor 3 and the theologians were on floor 4. And one of the things that like you sometimes found actually when like you were in the common room with other students was that some of the students who were really being turned on by Bonhoeffer as undergraduates, this is over 40 years ago, like were some of the most despicable people like you ever met in your life. So it's like, okay, like you're not exactly like the best advert for this supposedly important dude when he was supposed to be, I guess, a champion like for social justice. And certainly at the time, this was kind of Thatcherite Britain. There were a lot of very strong social conservative theologians who seemed to love Bonhoeffer but love injustice at the same time. Anyway, so we swiftly move on to my good friend Reggie Williams. So Reggie, all the way from St. Louis, Missouri, we invite you to share some thoughts.
Greetings, friends from St. Louis. I'm wondering if any of you have been over here to this part of the world before. You have. I see some of you have been here. Okay. All right. I was going to say you're not missing much if you haven't been, but um, those of you who have already been here, you know.
The state of misery.
The state of Missouri. Yep, 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 yep. It's called the Lou, where I'm at, and that can have a couple of different meanings to it. All of them are accurate in the description of this space. So anyway, this was a joy to be part of this project. A real joy to be there. First, this was my, and full disclosure, this was my first actual trip to the UK and doing this. First ever trip over to Oxford. Both Anthony and Tim are dear to me. I had the privilege of being on Tim's dissertation committee, and what a joy that was too. Wonderful project they put together. So, but what we're doing here and engaging. I got to meet Allison on that trip as well, and heard some. Some absolutely delightful people. And a portion of Oxford that was apparently where they filmed Harry Potter. All that was really interesting. What I'm tasked with discussing is the meaning of this to the Bonhoeffer Guild. And, we are a very broad community in that guild. I loved hearing the demand that certain voices must be heard, because I know that within the professional guild, that is certainly the case. If you know much about the history in the United States, my mom will tell me when she's growing up in the South that, and other people of, well, not that far away from us in generational age, that when a white person is coming towards you on the sidewalk, you've got to step off. Standard for survival in the South, especially any male, whatever age, and a white woman, step off the sidewalk. Black person in general, step off the sidewalk. And that kind of engagement happens academically as well. That this space belongs to this type of person, and anybody else is a visitor to that space, but you don't hold the space. The voices that are traditionally in that space are the ones that are the classics. They must be heard. They are the ones contributing academically, what might be considered as actual academic work. Everything else is extracurricular or, to be in the recommended reading list if it shows up at all. So the project here, as I understood it, is to do something different than that engagement with intellectual thought to begin with. It's something different than that. And to do that with a German theologian, no less, which is interesting to do, because there are certainly places within the academy that see that academic work is done by this particular community, and especially with this figure, and to be interpreted by this community. Anyone else is just a visitor. We've been talking about, I'll do a couple, I'm going to do this in a couple of ways. One is just to name what I engage in when we talk about the notion of otherness, first of all. And secondly, a little bit of history on the Guild itself. So maybe we'll start with the history. The International Dietrich Bonhoeffer Society began in 1971, German language, in 1971, as an effort to catalog Bonhoeffer's writings, to make sure to take them from the boxes that they were in Eberhard Bethge's basement, who was tasked with preserving Bonhoeffer's legacy himself. The late Ferdinand Schlingensiepen told Bethge, it takes, and he would say this in his German Sean Connery voice, one lightning strike, and all of it is gone. And with Schlingensiepen's insistence, helping to push Bethge, the Bonhoeffer Society was started. In 1973, the English language section of that society began. And the effort, as is at its beginning, is one of intellectual history. It is cataloging and representing the thought of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And the people who were core to that endeavor, most white men, were the interpreters of his legacy. And that is the society, strictly tasked with cataloging and interpreting that legacy in its own context. So you have, as it were, a figure in history and eyes on it to describe it. That's it. I am trained as an ethicist and a constructive theologian. The practice of simply in understanding the intellectual history is a portion of what I do. And there are some people that I rely heavily upon for that. One of them, my dear friend Michael Mawson, who is a brilliant intellectual historian. I want to point out his book, Christ Existing as Community, which I think is one of the best on that, and reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer in terms of his dissertation, Sanctum Communio, and the meaning of that engagement with as it's an ecclesiological text, which is different than one of the other historical theological historians or intellectual historians. Clifford Green wants to make a different pitch with that. Michael has done something brilliant with that to help us understand what Dietrich is doing in that text. And I believe you also touch on act and being. If it's primarily Sanctum Communio there, but the intellectual history is an important part of this endeavor. I'm a constructive theologian, an ethicist. And what we are doing and what this book is doing is engaging that intellectual history today. What does it mean to be thinking with Dietrich Bonhoeffer in our contemporary moments, whatever that may mean for us, contextually, historically, locally? How do we interpret what he's doing as a young German Christian inside of one of Europe's fascist murdering machines in a moment in Europe when there are other fascisms happening as a Christian? The challenge is to make sense of his moment and his engagement in our own. Can we do that? How do we do that? That's one. Secondly, to do that as people who are not centering the perspective of white people, not centering that. Do we see something different if we're not looking at that struggle as white people in Europe or with European history, with European context? What does that mean for us? In a current manuscript I'm working on, I'm engaging Dietrich again, similar to what I've done in this essay here. That, I mean, I apologize to you all because I know I handed you that essay in really raw form, but they did like magicians with that essay. It turns out actually brilliant. The work that you did to massage that into something more substantial. Thank you for that. The Ethics as Formation, which is one of the texts that I'm engaging in this current manuscript that I'm working on, for all of the work that's been done with ethics, which is not a ton, people don't really focus on that text as much. With all the work that's been done in ethics, there's a moment in which he's clear that he's still, as he's pushing beyond what is happening in Europe, he's still stuck with the same kind of European engagements that are present within Europe around other. And what do we mean by other? We're talking about Bonhoeffer, personhood, and otherness. This gets us into this claim here, that when we name human as inheritors of European ideas, what we're not actually talking about a biological reality, not something biological. What we're talking about is a concept, an idea that needs contrast. It needs an other in order to be legible. Other. When we talk otherness, we are also using the same kind of centering language as East, West, the global East, the global West, the global North, the global South, and so forth. All of those are situated in relationship to what? Europe, the metropole. So other is Europe's others. The people who are others don't have other as their frame of understanding human. What do we then learn from people who are not situated in the world in such centered ways? Dietrich was centered in the world in that conceptual way. And if we're to be thinking alongside him as he's dealing with a murderous fascist regime, what do we learn? What do we get? What do we gain from that practice? And that's what I think is what I find fascinating about this collection of constructive theology. I'll leave it there for now.
So thank you for all that you have brought, both to the project and your friendship as well. Now we hand over to Michael Mawson. We owe a great deal to Michael. If it's not been clear, our book is published within a book series that he oversees. And when we initially kind of pitched the idea to him with the purpose from the initial one-day conference, but realizing that it needs to be augmented, Michael, I think, very kindly sort of gave us his agreement that it would be published before even seeing the whole thing together. So thank you very much, Michael, for your support. And I now invite you to say a few words.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ka nui mihi kia koutou. Just to thank Reggie and others who have spoken. And it's really wonderful to be here tonight to be able to celebrate this book and be part of its launch. So as mentioned, I'm joining from Auckland in New Zealand. It's about 7:21 in the morning here, so I'm drinking coffee and toasting with coffee rather than with whatever some of you will be drinking. I've been invited to speak as one of the editors of this T&T Clark series, New Studies on Bonhoeffer's Theology and Ethics. The other editors are Professor Philip Ziegler, who's up in Aberdeen, and Jenny McBride, who's in Atlanta, Georgia. And so this is, of course, the series that includes the book that we're launching tonight. The series started in 2020, and Bonhoeffer in the Voice of the Others, the 16th book that we've published within this series. What we're trying to do with the T&T Clark series is foster cutting-edge scholarship on Bonhoeffer, both from emerging scholars and more established scholars. And increasingly, we've been trying to showcase and capture some of the diverse ways that Bonhoeffer's being drawn on in various parts of the world. So that is thinking about Bonhoeffer and the way his theology intersects with racial logics, ways that it's being used to contest new forms of authoritarianism, to respond to the climate crisis and various other global and local challenges. So in other words, not just looking at scholarship on Bonhoeffer's theology per se, which, as Reggie's just mentioned, is clearly important, but increasingly we've been trying to encourage scholarship that draws in contemporary struggles and political movements. So how do Bonhoeffer's writings inspire and support Christians and others in struggles for survival and for justice? And so for this reason, the book we're discussing tonight, Bonhoeffer and the Voice of the Other, is a near perfect example of what the series is trying to be about. So I think this book captures part of our vision and also expands it and carries it forward, or sort of presses the series in useful ways as well. The three editors, so Anthony, Tim, and Alison, you've put together an incredible list of contributors. And when I first saw the book proposal, I was really excited about the lineup and what you were planning. Here I can't resist just mentioning one person who stood out on the table of contents. So this is Josiah Young, who, as far as I'm aware, hasn't written on Bonhoeffer in a number of years. I had lunch with him about 2 or 3 years ago, and we had great conversations about James Baldwin and all sorts of things, but he didn't seem to be doing much on Bonhoeffer or thinking a whole lot about Bonhoeffer. So it was a coup to get him involved in the project. And I think his chapter alone is probably worth the hefty price of the book. So he draws some rich parallels between Cohn and Bonhoeffer, but also uses Cohn to put pressure on aspects of Bonhoeffer's thinking and present some important challenges in ways that I think Anthony highlighted earlier as well. And I think actually this captures a theme that ran through a number of the chapters. So a willingness to be critical of Bonhoeffer, or at least to press some hard questions. And Tim highlighted this in his remarks earlier as well. Chris White's chapter would be another example of this. And I liked your description in your afterword, Anthony, of Bonhoeffer as a faithful and fallible saint. And the ways in which your afterword put pressure on the white privilege that is certainly running through Bonhoeffer's studies and perhaps also through Bonhoeffer himself. Just in terms of broad themes that run through the book, it was also encouraging to see the commitment of the editors to recognizing Bonhoeffer as a global figure. So the book includes chapters from scholars like Carlos Caldas writing about Brazil, Samuel Torres, who engages with Bonhoeffer in relation to experiences of families facing enforced disappearances in Mexico. With respect to the Asian context, Jason Lamb engaging with ways that Bonhoeffer's drawn on by Chinese dissidents, including those without Christian commitments. And then Sanyo Park, who writes about Bonhoeffer's recent appeals to Bonhoeffer in South Korea, and particularly ways that Bonhoeffer is being appropriated by far-right Christians in the Korean context. So in ways that perhaps parallel what's also going on in the US at the moment. And finally, in terms of contributors and chapters and some of these broad themes, I was struck by the commitment to contextuality that ran through most of the chapters as well. So perhaps highlighted by Ali McLaughlin's more biographical chapter at the beginning of the book, and then in a different way by the 2 chapters on preaching that close the collection. So those of Leah Weber and Chris Wilson. And while preaching's always clearly contextual, Wilson's chapter highlights this by relating Bonhoeffer's theology of preaching to the context of Northern Ireland. So I'm aware I haven't mentioned all of the chapters here, and I had a couple of notes on some of the others that Alison nicely talked about and covered. I also wanted to leave a few surprises for potential readers, and I guess just encourage you all to go off and purchase a copy of the book and begin working through it for yourself. Justin, I can see on your shelf you've got a couple of gaps here, so there's room for at least one copy of this book. I will note that the book's rather expensive, and I do apologise for that. If you can't afford it or are feeling slightly unsure about taking out a second mortgage, please encourage your libraries to purchase it. I'll also mention that they switched to paperback in about a year to 18 months, so it will switch over to paperback next year at some point, and that'll drop to about a third of the price. If there's anyone who's enterprising and based in Oxford, you could also just run off some photocopies of it and peddle them outside of Oxford colleges, and you might be able to make a few dollars doing that as well. I'll send you the PDF if you cut me in, so we can talk about that. I should just close by just congratulating and thanking the 3 editors one more time. So Tim, Alison, and Anthony, thank you for all your work on this. Thank you for approaching us to include it in the T&T Clark series and just putting together such an extraordinary list of authors and topics. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you very much for your very, very gracious words, Michael, and for getting up so early on the other side of the world like to join us. So thank you very, very much, very much. We will open things up for questions in a moment. Just to say one quick thing, really, from my perspective about the book, because I found myself actually relearning something quite important. So when I did my initial undergraduate studies, it was not uncommon, like to do the very things that Reggie has been quite rightly pushing us at in terms of thinking about otherness and who is the other. And so doing a degree largely in church history was largely to look at very, very dominating figures whose writing was never contextual but always universal. And they had all the answers for all the questions that people have posed and questions that we haven't yet posed. But they were the places where the answers were. And certainly when I first went into the academy, I remember going to a conference in Cambridge, and someone was presenting a paper, this would be mid-90s, on Bonhoeffer, and it was something like reading the problems of Palestine through the lens of Bonhoeffer. And I remember thinking, this Bonhoeffer dude must be really brilliant because he can speak to a context that was never even germane when he was alive, but somehow he has the answer. So it's not people in Palestine who have the answers to their problems. It's this white, dead German dude. So obviously that then became one of my fierce, I guess, riposts in terms of when I was doing my doctorate, that I was going to decenter all these voices. And I think what I've learned from this project is not that decentering work is not important, but it's also a reminder that genius and greatness can transcend context, which is not to say that Bonhoeffer has all the answers for everything, but he is a helpful dialogue partner in the way in which all great scholarship is. All great scholarship is contextual, of course it is, but it's not contained solely within its context. So, for example, like you should read James Cone because he's a great theologian, not because he has something to say like to other black folk. He has something to say to everybody. And I think that's the one thing perhaps I have relearned really actually sort of through this work. I think an appreciation that great work is of its time, but it always has something to say to other contexts without necessarily verifying it or turning those individuals into saint figures that can't be critiqued or challenged. Anyway, that said, so we've got about 25 minutes for questions. If you have a question, please put it into the chat box. That would be helpful. If you're not quite so good at the writing stuff, like you can also raise a hand as well. And I will invite you to unmute yourself and try ask a question and not so much engage in your alternative chapter that you might have written if you were invited to be in the book. Very much. We're almost out of time, not quite. We do have another contributor to the book with us. That's Craig Gardner. Craig, would you like to say a few words about your piece and just generally how you find being a part of the project?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I have found the well, surprise at the beginning that I was accepted to give a paper. Greater surprise when I realized how many other people hadn't been accepted. And then even greater surprise, and perhaps not a little shame, as an almost 60 white male, to realize that I felt incredibly seen at various points along the discussion. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to be there. And what Alison said, thank you, because that was always the ambition. Even when I wrote my doctoral thesis, it was to write the thesis in a way that, not that it required least amount of re-editing to become a book, but that it was being written in a way that it would be accessible to reasonable kind of degree of readership. And so I think that's what I intended to do with the chapter, was to kind of make it a bridging point between high scholarship and reasonably interested accessibility. And I think the other thing I wanted to do was to try and bring a kind of creative edge to it. I know one of my former colleagues and Baptist scholar, Karen Smith, is currently working on a book of letters that have been written or should have been written or might have been written. And it reflects just the idea of doing theology. So much theology in the past was done through letters and correspondence of spiritual directors one to another. And quite often you get these comments back from one to another where it says, I'm sorry it's taken me 3 months to reply, but I've been thinking through what you said. And it gives that reflexivity, that kind of theological reflection that goes on that maybe doesn't happen when you read a finely honed, edited chapter in a book. And there's a rawness to the letters that sometimes comes through. So that was what the idea behind that was trying to do something a little bit more creative, with not saying that other people weren't creative, but trying to do something that was a little bit slightly different. And it was, as nearly always, it came out of my engagement with my greatest spiritual director, who's 6 years old, has four legs and a waggy tail, and walking with the dog. When those two things slipped in, the idea of the tending, teaching, telling kind of format of mission. And what would Bonhoeffer have said in this reconstructed theology that he wanted for a post-war Europe? What would he have said? And were there traces of that already in the letters? And so that's how that came about. And I really enjoyed writing it, which is always a good sign. So I hope other people enjoy reading it. And I am just so grateful for the opportunity to have been part of it.
Thank you very much, Craig. And I think that is a very opportune point on which to conclude our evening. So first, let me say thank you to my co-editors. That's to Tim and to Alison for your huge amount of work. I was more of a kind of benign elder passenger, quite frankly, to be honest with you. I'm more than happy to help out, but a lot of the legwork really was done by Tim and Alison, so thank you to you. And then to Reggie and to Craig, has been here as contributors to the book. Edited books are only as good as the people who are willing to write for them. And so thank you very much for your contributions. And those of all the other people in the book who are not willing to be with us. I do, like Michael, I feel particularly proud that I was able to pin down Josiah Young. Those who are not familiar with him, he's one of the great, I guess, our Black theologians in the world, actually one of the elders of our discipline. And getting him to write is always, I wouldn't say it's a chore, but it's just that, like, he's always busy, he's always got lots to do. And so to get him to write actually a very unflinchingly, brilliantly honest and searing critique, both not so much Bonhoeffer, but just of the presumptions we sometimes make that Reggie has raised. Anyway, but thank you for all of you who have joined us this evening. As I said, it's not a cheap book, so if you can't afford to buy it, we'll understand. But do encourage academic libraries to get it if you have access to any of them. And hopefully it'll be out as a paperback, not quite so expensive, in about a year's time, maybe 18 months' time. So anyway, so thank you very much for joining us and for all the questions and for the engagement. Thanks again for all people, for all of you who have turned up. Thank you to Carol, behind the scenes to help with the administration. And I look forward to catching some of you again on other occasions. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.